A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John, chapter 19. Pilate then had Jesus taken away and scourged, and the soldiers, twisting thorns into a wreath, put it on his head and clothed him in a purple robe. They kept coming up to him and saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and slapping him in the face. Pilate came outside again and said to them, "Look, I am going to bring him out to you to let you know that I find no case against him." Jesus then came out, wearing the wreath of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said, "Here is the man." When they saw him, the chief priests and the guards shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no case against him." The Jews replied, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has claimed to be Son of God." When Pilate heard them say this, he was more afraid. He entered the praetorium again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate then said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus replied, "You would have no authority over me at all if it had not been given you from above. That is why the man who handed me over to you has the greater guilt." Jesus is condemned to death. From that moment, Pilate sought to set him free. But the Jews cried out, "If you set this man free, you are no friend of Caesar's. Everyone who makes himself king is defying Caesar." Hearing these words, Pilate had Jesus brought out and seated himself on the chair of judgment at a place called the Pavement, in Hebrew, Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation for the Passover at about noon. Pilate said to the Jews, "Here is your king." But they shouted, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate said, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So at that, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. The crucifixion. They then took Jesus, and carrying the cross for himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha, where they crucified him and with him 2 others, one on either side, Jesus being in the middle. Pilate wrote out a notice and fixed it to the cross. It read, "Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this notice because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the writing was in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. So the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write King of the Jews, but this man said, 'I am King of the Jews.'" Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." Jesus' garments divided. When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothing and divided it into 4 shares, one for each soldier, and his tunic. His tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top right through. So they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but let us cast lots about it, whose it shall be." This was to fulfill the words of Scripture, "They divide my garments among them and cast lots for my clothes." That is what the soldiers did. Jesus and his mother. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary of Magdala. Seeing his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing near her, Jesus said to his mother, "Woman, this is your son." Then to the disciple he said, "This is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his home. The death of Jesus. After this, Jesus, knowing that everything had now been completed, and so that the scripture should be fulfilled, he said, "I am thirsty." A jar full of sour wine stood there. So, putting a sponge soaked in the wine on a hyssop stick, they held it to his mouth. After Jesus had taken the wine, he said, "It is completed." And bowing his head, he gave over his spirit. The pierced Christ. It was the day of preparation, and to avoid the bodies remaining on the cross during the Sabbath, since that Sabbath was a day of special dignity, the Jews asked Pilate to have their legs broken and the bodies taken away. Consequently, the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first man and of the other who had been crucified with him. When they came to Jesus, they saw he was already dead. So they did not break his legs, but one of the soldiers pierced his side with a lance, and immediately there came out blood and water. The one who saw it has borne witness, and his witness is true. And he knows that he is telling the truth, so that you also may believe. For this happened that the scripture should be fulfilled. None of his bones shall be broken. And again, in another place, scripture says, they will look on the one they have pierced. The burial. After this, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, though a secret one through fear of the Jews, asked Pilate to let him remove the body of Jesus. Pilate gave permission, so he came and took it away. Nicodemus came as well, the same one who had come to Jesus at night time, and he brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, weighing about 50 kilograms. They took the body of Jesus and wrapped it in linen cloths with the spices, according to the Jewish burial custom. In the place where he had been crucified, there was a garden, and in this garden, a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. Since it was the day of preparation for the Jews, and the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. The word of the Lord.